Hello, my name is Villarreal. This is my second speech on the influenza pandemic of 1918. I've gathered three of my friends here via Zoom to watch me give my presentation. So let's get started. In 1918, the deadly influenza flu killed over 50 million people, which was more than the total from the death count of World War I. People don't often associate the influenza pandemic with being so deadly, but in Jeffrey R. Tobenberger's and David M. Morin's article, 1918 Influenza, the Mother of All Pandemics, uh, they stated it was the most devastating pandemic ever. In these next slides, we will learn about the beginning, impacts, and consequences, which are associated with the 1918 influenza flu. Okay, let's start at the beginning where the influenza outbreak began. The beginning and early spread of the influenza pandemic was due to the spread during World War I. War spread it fast. Anton Roca, author of Origins of the Spanish Influenza Pandemic, 1918 to 1920, and its relation to the First World War, explained that the start of the influenza pandemic could be associated from the military camps being overpopulated, unhygienic, and troops constantly moving around. In the influenza pandemic of 1918, writer Elizabeth Fee explains that multiple countries' troops kept moving around. There was a lack of nutrition, and poor health allowed for the influenza flu to spread quicker than anyone could have imagined. Unfortunately, let's look at the true devastation that this influenza flu caused on a global level. The influenza flu caused a lethal global impact and little government response. The influenza flu infected over 500 million people and killed from anywhere from 17 to 100 million people. That's a rough estimate. Hospitals were at overcapacity due to the number of people coming in. During America's Forgotten Pandemic, the influenza of 1918, author Alfred W. Crosby explains that due to governments in countries like the UK and France not taking the pandemic as seriously as they should, it allowed for mass hysteria to break out amongst the public, and it took a long time for people to figure out the cure. People didn't even realize how bad it had gone until death tolls started to rise. Even though the human mortality was destructive to the world's population and the 1918 influenza pandemic had long-term consequences, it left a long legacy that we are still experiencing today. The 1918 influenza pandemic had long-term consequences and a lasting impact due to historians continuing to study the lessons from it. The flu allowed hospitals and health research facilities to transform in a positive direction so that the pandemic like this could never happen again. Unfortunately, we are still experiencing pandemics such as COVID-19 in the early 2020s. This led to the influenza flu pandemic led to permanent public health institutions. We still continue to learn about the history, statistics, and science behind the pandemic. Howard Phillips, author of The Recent Wave of Spanish Flu Histography, showed that the flu has changed how we study infectious diseases, new clinical trials, and medical studies. Finally, let's do a recap of the most important parts of the 1918 influenza pandemic that we discussed so far. The pandemic started during the main part of World War I, spread out at an unprecedented rate, killed at least 50 million people, and changed how we deal with health and diseases at large in the world. Even though most people don't think about the influenza pandemic anymore, its lasting effects on the globe changes how our society deals with public health and diseases now. Thank you so much for listening. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Hey, Ray. So you mentioned you mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic in your presentation. And regarding the mass hysteria and bad handling by other governments, do you draw similarities from the influenza pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic in that way?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, with the start of World War I and the governments trying to kind of cover up with the Spanish flu, or it was the Spanish influenza, COVID-19, the mass hysteria associated with that was almost unparalleled. The first few days after the first case of COVID-19 broke out, all the countries across the globe had their own ways of dealing with it. But the main thing associated with all of them was true panic and hysteria. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels that can be tied between two, whether that's masks or like how the governments have dealt with it and are still dealing with it. So, thank you very much.